The first light of dawn broke over the city of Bamberg, and with it, the blade of justice caught the glow of the rising sun. You can almost picture it, can't you? By the way, where are you watching from right now? Imagine that same sunrise breaking over your own city as we step back into history. It was May 1st, 1573, a day that would mark both an ending and a beginning. In the heart of the town square, a 19-year-old man named Frantz Schmidt stepped forward, not to witness a spectacle, but to create one. As the air grew heavy with anticipation, time itself seemed to hold its breath. What time is it where you are right now? Because in that moment, for the people of Bamberg, time froze, and a new chapter of history began to unfold before their eyes. Before him knelt a trembling thief, bound and awaiting his fate. The murmurs of the crowd swirled like wind around the scaffold. As Schmidt gripped the hilt of the executioner's sword for the first time, the weight he carried was heavier than the steel itself. The burden of his family's name, the expectations of imperial law, and the centuries-old stain that followed his bloodline. And then, with a single, deliberate swing, Frantz Schmidt began a career that would end 394 lives and redefine the meaning of justice in the Holy Roman Empire. But Schmidt was not born a killer. He was born an heir to a curse. His father, Heinrich Schmidt, had once been nothing more than a humble woodsman. That was until the Margrave of Brandenburg-Ansbach forced him into the grim role of executioner, a command one did not refuse without consequence. From that day forward, the name Schmidt became synonymous not with labor or craft, but with death. In the Holy Roman Empire, executioners were a paradox, necessary to society yet ostracized by it. They served the law but were exiled from humanity. They were paid by princes and councils, but denied entry into guilds, churches, and respectable professions. Their very touch was thought to bring bad luck. France, born into this world of silent scorn, made a choice few would dare, not to run from his family's shame, but to redeem it. Under the stern guidance of his father in the town of Hof, he learned the art of death: strangulation, sword beheading, flogging, and the many forms of public humiliation punishments demanded by the law. His training was not one of cruelty, but of precision, a grim discipline that turned death into ritual. Years later, in the bustling city of Bamberg, young Schmidt would face his first public execution. The city, rising in power as a key administrative hub of Franconia, had summoned him to perform the sentence. And in his now famous execution diary, Schmidt immortalized the moment with chilling simplicity. On May 1st, 1573, I wielded the sword for the first time in Bamberg, but that entry was far more than a mere record. It marked the instant when a boy inherited the empire's coldest duty, the moment when justice and stigma fused into one man's destiny. To the crowd, he was both servant and sinner. To the council, merely a paid official. Indeed, Bamberg's ledgers list his first payment with bureaucratic indifference. The executioner Frantz Schmidt is paid for the sentence carried out. Yet behind that sterile note was a young man who had just taken a life, not in hatred or vengeance, but under the watchful eyes of law and necessity. He was the hand of justice, even as the world recoiled from his touch. But Schmidt's ambition extended far beyond the scaffold. He sought something no executioner had ever dared dream of: legitimacy. Over the next 2 decades, Frantz Schmidt would become one of the most respected, even sought-after, officials in the entire empire. He had not merely mastered the act of execution, he had elevated it into an institution. His rise was not just a personal victory. It revealed something darker and more profound about his age: that in the Holy Roman Empire, even an outcast could ascend, if his blade was sharp enough and his precision beyond question. The ritual of justice, the public executions of Frantz Schmidt. The square at Nuremberg's Hauptmarkt was packed. Children perched on barrels. Merchants leaned on their stalls. The air buzzed with the strange mixture of fear and fascination that always followed an execution day. At the center of the scaffold stood a man in dark official garb, motionless, composed, almost priest-like. Before him, a condemned murderer knelt beside a wooden block. Then came the sound that silenced the crowd. A single, perfect stroke. Frantz Schmidt had done his work again. Between 1573 and 1617, Schmidt would perform 394 executions across the Holy Roman Empire. But what made his legacy remarkable wasn't the number, it was the ritual. Each killing was a precise ceremony, bound by imperial law, local custom, and symbolic meaning. To city councils, Schmidt wasn't a monster. He was a civil servant, the human embodiment of justice. His sword wasn't a weapon, but a signature. Every execution he performed was logged with meticulous care in his diary, a record that survives to this day. One entry, dated July 15, 1589, details the beheading of a convicted murderer named Andreas Rascher. I beheaded Andreas Rascher with the sword. He had murdered a man on the road to Würzburg. The act was carried out in public, quick and exacting. Sword beheading, unlike hanging or breaking on the wheel, was considered an honorable death, typically reserved for men of higher social status. The blade, sharp and unflinching, granted its victims a strange kind of dignity, but it also demanded perfection from the one who wielded it. One mistake, one trembling motion, could turn the spectacle of justice into a grotesque horror. And so Frantz Schmidt, the outcast, the son of a woodsman turned executioner, became the most disciplined hand of death the empire had ever known. A single failed stroke meant more than just error. It meant agony, humiliation, and disgrace. But Frantz Schmidt, by every surviving account, never failed. His hand was as precise as his conscience was steady. Yet not every death under his charge carried the dignity of a clean blade. On April 3, 1587, Schmidt recorded one of the most horrifying duties of his career, the execution of a serial murderer by the infamous breaking wheel, a device that stood as one of Europe's most feared instruments of punishment. This was not merely a means to kill, it was a method to unmake a man. One by one, each limb was crushed under the weight of an iron club. The condemned was often kept alive through it all, conscious, gasping, and writhing, as the wheel turned him into a symbol of retribution. Schmidt's diary entry for that day was short, cold, and painfully clinical. But between the lines, the horror is unmistakable. The screams, the silence of the watching crowd, and the slow, inevitable end, all part of a ritual meant for the worst of humanity. Murderers, traitors, and heretics. Punishment in that age was more than justice. It was theater. It was gendered, symbolic, and deeply moralized. Schmidt once detailed the execution of a woman condemned for infanticide, the killing of her own child. Her sentence was Saxdos, death by drowning inside a sealed sack, often with a dog, a rooster, or a snake bound beside her. It was an ancient Germanic practice, as cruel as it was symbolic. The water represented cleansing, society washing away an act too monstrous to comprehend. Sometimes these drownings were public. Other times they were carried out quietly, before a small gathering of city officials. But whether witnessed by thousands or a handful, the message remained clear. Some sins could only be answered by oblivion. Even fire was within Schmidt's grim duties. To burn alive was reserved for crimes not only seen as deadly, but as poisonous to the soul. Witchcraft, sorcery, heresy, and the secret art of poisoning. These were the crimes of corruption, of invisible death, and the sentence was purification through flame. The spectacle was devastating. The crackling of fire, the wailing of the condemned, the smell of smoke that carried for miles. Yet through it all, Schmidt stood calm. Not sadistic, not gleeful, but solemn. His role was not cruelty. It was order. His hand did not tremble, because the empire could not afford a trembling hand. In a world where crime was punished before the eyes of the crowd, the executioner did not stand at the margins of society. He stood at its center, as the human face of the state's authority. A man's limbs crushed upon the wheel sent a message. This is justice. A single, clean sword stroke was reassurance. The law still holds. France Schmidt's executions were not acts of medieval chaos. They were acts of statecraft, the empire made visible through ritual and discipline. But the story does not end on the scaffold. From blood to honor, the unlikely legacy of an executioner. In Nuremberg's St. Rochus Cemetery lies a quiet stone. No grim insignia, no skull, no trace of shame. Its inscription instead honors a man who once embodied both vengeance and mercy. Frantz Schmidt, executioner, healer, honored in death as in life. For nearly half a century, he ended lives beneath the gaze of thousands. Yet, in the twilight of his years, he began to save them. Born into a profession cursed by society, Schmidt's trade was a paradox. Necessary, yet despised. He served the empire faithfully, yet could not touch the hands of his neighbors without scorn. His children were denied guilds and churches. His very name carried the weight of ritual impurity. And yet, in 1617, after executing his 394th condemned soul, Schmidt laid down his sword, not out of despair, but transformation. He devoted himself to healing, using the knowledge of anatomy, bone, and muscle gained through years of grim familiarity with death. He began treating the living. He set bones, healed wounds, prepared herbal salves, and in time, the same people who once crossed the street to avoid him came seeking his care. In his own diary, he wrote with quiet humility, "I ceased serving at the block and began attending to the ill." It was a transformation so remarkable that even the emperor took notice. In 1624, Emperor Ferdinand II issued a decree unlike any other in imperial history. For the first time, an executioner was declared Ehrlich, honorable. The imperial decree finally lifted the hereditary stain that had long shadowed Schmidt's bloodline, restoring to him and his family the dignity that centuries of judgment had taken away. The man once condemned to embody death itself had, in the end, become a living emblem of redemption. When Frantz Schmidt passed away in 1634, he did not die an outcast or a figure of shame. He left this world as a respected citizen of Nuremberg, a man whose life forced history to stop, to question, and to reconsider where the line between sin and sanctity truly lies. His grave still stands today as a testament to one of history's great paradoxes, that a man who lived by the sword could die with his name cleansed, that hands once stained with blood could, through time and mercy, come to symbolize healing. And it leaves us with a question that lingers long after the story ends, a question meant not just for history, but for all of us. Can a soul bound to death ever truly find redemption? Can justice, when delivered by an outcast, ever be accepted by the very society it serves? Tell me what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy exploring the forgotten stories, paradoxes, and haunting truths of our past, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Vassal Truths. New historical journeys await everyday stories that challenge what we think we know, and remind us that even in history's darkest corners, redemption can still be found.